Hello, you wonderful literacy educators. My name is Frank Cottrell Boyce. Don't want to brag, but I am actually the UK Waterstones Children's Laureate, and I have got the medal to prove it. Very proud of this. I'm sure I've got nothing to teach you about multilingual education, but I have a couple of experiences to share. One is like a kind of a fairy story. It takes place in a castle, fairy story castle in Germany. I'm going to show you the castle. Here it is. It is like literally a castle from a fairy story. It's called Bluten Castle and it's near Munich. And a few years ago, well, quite a few years ago actually, I won a prize in Germany for one of my books. It was called The Unforgotten Coat. This is it in English. In German, it was called Der Unvergessen Mantel. And I was whisked away to this castle. It was very glamorous, very excited. I knew nothing about this castle. It is actually the headquarters of IBI. It's the International Youth Library. And the story behind it, which maybe you already know, but I didn't know, is a kind of fairy story and an inspiring one. The International Youth Library was founded by a woman called Jella Lettman, a Jewish woman who'd been growing up in Germany before the war, and luckily her family managed to get out and get to London in 1936. So they survived all the horrors of the war. And after the war, obviously Germany was completely broken. It'd been bombed, it'd been starved. Its whole, well, I don't need to go into any detail. You know how bad it was. Jella decided to go back. She was very young. She decided she wanted to go back and rebuild her country, a place that people were desperate to leave. And her priority was to build bonds between nations, and she thought, and peoples and classes. And she thought the best way to do this was stories. So she began the International Youth Library. She began it very small. It began in a van, I think. It's a heroic thing to do, to begin to tell stories in a broken landscape where people were hungry. And I found this absolutely amazing and truthful and wise. And it's an amazing place to go, and humbling. And she's been my hero ever since. And I feel very lucky to have been part of the heritage, the legacy that she left, because I came across lots of stories in translation growing up and had very strong ideas about other countries, because we are the stories that we tell. Every nation is the story that it tells. And when you hear their stories, you touch their souls. And that's a wonderful and amazing thing. The other thing I wanted to share with you about multilingual education comes from the same book. So until very recently, until I became laureate, for the last 7 or 8 years, I worked very closely with a refugee charity in my hometown of Liverpool, which is a very multilingual town. And I was dealing with visas for new arrivals. And blessedly, a lot of my books, although they're set in Liverpool, have been translated into other languages. So I would give people copies of these books when they first arrived and they were a bit lost and trying to orientate themselves. And to have a book set in a new place, but in your old language, I can tell you that is a really, really powerful thing. I'm not bragging about this. It was just a wonderful thing to be able to do, to go, look, you can read about these streets, but in your own tongue. That was really wonderful. You could see how empowering that was. We talk a lot about how children want to be seen, their sexuality, their race, their class, but they want to be heard too. And to have their language heard and noticed and celebrated and treasured a little bit, that's the next step. That's allowing someone into your soul a little bit. It's a really wonderful thing, that. So yes, there needs to be a place in a classroom for your own language. Just wanted to share that because it was an experience. It's not an idea. It's something that I saw and felt very privileged to be able to do, and felt like a little kind of tiny version of what Jella Lettman was doing. So thank you for what you're doing, and please, please, please keep doing it.
When it comes to social and cultural challenges, I think all of us as grown-ups, parents, teachers, guardians, we try to shield our children as much as possible from the hard realities of life. And that's sometimes because, particularly with older ones, they don't want to be lectured to, they don't want us telling them what we think. And that's where literature can be really powerful. Very often in a young person's life, the last adult voice that they're still listening to, still paying heed to, is the author's voice. And we're in the privileged position that we get to speak directly to their minds and to their hearts. So in terms of passing on societal values, of trying to tell children that there's more than one story, I think books are invaluable. They'll also hear things in books that they won't hear from their peer group. Young people are inexperienced in the world, and very often they have one take on what's going on, whether that be issues to do with drug taking, issues to do with racism, with homelessness. All of those stories can end up being one voice, one response, because that's the only voice the peer group is aware of. Again, we now have books written for children on every issue under the sun. So I think there was an advertising campaign there a while ago saying, there's an app for that. Well, I would say, there's a book for that. So whatever social challenge, whatever difficult topic that people want to discuss with their children, I think the very best way is to do it through a book. Because remember as well with the book, we're not just telling them about the problems, we're not just explaining it, we're asking them to be the main actor. For the duration of reading that book, they are that person. And what better way is there of understanding someone else's dilemma than being that person?
Hello, I'm Sally Rippin. I'm the current Australian Children's Laureate for 2024 and 2025. And I think the power of sharing books with children is one that I will never take for granted. I feel like it's such an incredibly unique privilege to be in this world where I can create stories where children can see themselves reflected. And one particular book that I'm so proud of to have worked with a co-author, her name is Eliza Hull, is this book called Come Over to My House. Now this one is very much based on a book that I read when I was very young, which was also called Come Over to My House. And I loved it because it invited us into the homes of people all across the world. So I got to learn that in Japan, people ate rice with chopsticks. And in France, people ate, I can't even remember the whole story, but people slept on different types of beds and people had different kinds of conversations. And it kind of blew my mind as a child that there were so many different ways of living in the world. And these were all homes and families very much like ours, just with very different ways of living under the roof. And so Eliza and I have worked to do the same thing in this book, but in this case, we're introducing children to families who may live with disabilities, different types of disabilities, and the things that they use in their home to get around and to make their home life more comfortable. So I think every single book I aim to write is to introduce children to the fact that there might be another way of being in the world, but at the same time, there are many connections and many similarities between the characters that you read about and potentially how you feel yourself too. And I think it's such a beautiful dichotomy in that we can introduce something new, but also aim to create something that feels familiar to the child as well. So I am excited that the theme for this year for International Literacy Day is about promoting multilingual education. I'm reading it off my computer just so I got it right, because I think in a sense, the more we encourage children to be able to express themselves in their own language, the more we encourage them to bring their stories from their families into the classroom and to be able to share them with everybody, the more we're going to have access to this broad, beautiful, wide range of stories that make up the world that we live in. So it's a real honor to be a part of International Literacy Day. And it's also an incredible honor to be able to write stories that children can connect with from all across the world.
As a children's author, I'm seeing the changing face of our society here in Ireland. Every school now has a diverse population, children who came from situations of war or poverty, children from all over the world who've come to live here. You hear every language, you hear about every culture, and I think that has to be good for our children. I know here in Ireland, we are making an effort. But when you go into our schools, you see posters in more than one language. And remember, we have a history of this. We're already bilingual. Many of our people already speak Irish, and we've worked hard over the years to give equality to those languages. This is a further extension. There is no better way to promote understanding amongst peoples, I think, than to have our children exposed to so many different races, different languages. And literacy is crucial to all of that. We live in a world where literacy is the way we communicate. That feeling of not being able to say what you think, not to have your voice heard because you are not literate, is heartbreaking to me. We live in a democracy, and by its nature, a democracy means that we all get to say what we think. We all get to have an opinion. But we communicate now more and more through the written word. There's another form of literacy also creeping in. As well as the written word, we have to contend with digital communication. And for people who can't use computers, who aren't computer literate, they also can be left in the dark, isolated from the rest of the field. Literacy is crucial in our world. And hearing lots of languages, experiencing lots of cultures can only be good for our society. I think because language is more than a collection of words, more than a way of communicating. It's a repository of our story, of our past. It's like an archaeology. I know here in Ireland, we have words in the Irish language that live on when we speak English. There's a great example of one, because we're a farming community. There was a word that is mehel, which was the coming together of neighbours to help one another at times that were busy on the farm, like bringing in the harvest. But nowadays, we use the word mehel when we speak in English. We say, if you're doing up your house, you might say, oh, well, we'll need a whole mehel to help us to do that. And in that way, our past lives on. So that collective memory, I think, is really important when it comes to literacy. I hope that by having fewer boundaries, of bringing people together, we can cultivate a feeling of mutual understanding and respect. And we can do it through all kinds of literacy.
Hello, it's Sally Rippin, the Australian Children's Laureate for 2024 and 2025. And I have a particular interest in this year's theme for International Literacy Day, in that even though I was born in Australia, I grew up in many countries overseas, many of them where English wasn't the first language. So because of my father's job, we moved around quite a lot. All throughout Southeast Asia, so Indonesia, Hong Kong, and later as a young adult, I went to live in China, where my father had lived for a very long time. So I grew up in a world where when I would go out into the street, everybody was speaking a different language to how we spoke at home. And this was also a time before the internet, the dark ages, where there were only a few channels on the television and many of them weren't in English. So I think that what that gave me is the capacity to read beyond language, in a sense. So I would look at the way that people interacted, I would listen to the tone of their voices, I would look at body language, facial expression, to try to pick up cues of what people were saying and how they were feeling about each other. And I think it made me very porous to the world and very much an observer, to not rely on language just to be able to tell what was going on. And I do believe this is something I bring into all my writing. And I think I'm particularly interested in the perspective, what it feels like to be an outsider. I think a lot of teenagers in particular, when they're growing up, they do feel very disconnected from the world and they're trying to find their identity and work out who they are. And I think as writers, it's almost a beneficial position to feel a little bit like an observer, like an outsider, and to try to look at the world from the outside in, because then we're looking at it with really highly attuned eyes and not taking things for granted. And the other thing that children do that when I was teaching writing for children, I would often encourage my students to think about, these were adults, was every experience a child has is often their first experience. And so children walk through the world in a state of awe. They look at things that move them in a way that we often take for granted as we get older. And I think this is quite a vital part of tapping into your creative self, is looking at the world as if you're seeing it for the first time. And I think this is a way that children see the world. It's a way we connect with creativity, and I think it's a really vital part of building imagination. So, having grown up in many countries where English was not the first language, I, as a young adult, picked up Mandarin when I was studying in China. And when I came back to Australia, I was tutoring Chinese Australian children, and one student in particular, a young girl called Fang Fang, would complain to me a lot about how her parents always wanted her to speak Chinese at home. But every time she would go into the classroom or out into the world, everyone was speaking English. So she felt very much like an outsider, and she'd get very frustrated with her parents about this. And I would try to explain to her that there were reasons why her parents would want her to speak Chinese at home, and she couldn't work out what those reasons might be. So it inspired me to write a book for her called Speak Chinese, Fang Fang. And I put her experience into the book because this was quite a long time ago, nearly 30 years ago. We couldn't find any books out there that reflected her experience. And once she saw her story in a book, she was able to give it that distance to really see that potentially this was something to be proud of, to go to speak another language, and a really fantastic thing that she shared with her parents and another small community that they lived among. So that was my very first book and my first experience of bringing this story to the world. And it's connected with people on so many different levels. So obviously people who've grown up without English as a first language, but also just people who have felt often like outsiders and that potentially they have a disconnect with the world. And I think that's what stories have the power to do, in that if we find ourselves in a book and we see ourselves reflected, that we're more likely to feel that we're not so alone in the world. So I think certainly introducing children to the fact that we do live among so many languages is really important and vital. And I think that through different languages we have access to different stories as well. So I think bringing our children up in multilingual environments, exposing them to translations so that they can access stories from other people around the world, all this is just a really great opportunity to grow and develop empathy and to connect with what it's like to be the other. And I think that's the power of stories, is that we really get a sense of understanding what it's like to be someone other than ourselves in the world.
Hi, Frank Cottrell, Boyce again. Did I mention that I'm the UK Children's Laureate and that I've got a medal? I feel really blessed that a few times in my life I've lived in places where there was a language, a local language, a language that was not the majority language of that country. So I lived in the Basque Country, and I also live in Liverpool, which has a language of its own. But I'm really talking about the fact that Liverpool is really, really, really close to Wales. And so I don't have to go very far to see road signs and instructions in Welsh. Both those languages, governments have tried to wipe them out in the past. In fact, if you went into school in Wales in the 19th century or even the beginning of the 20th century, you would see a sign saying Welsh not. Being aware of those languages and their different way of looking at the world. When people defend speaking these minority languages, these half languages, as they're called, they always say, well, they carry our history. Our history is in this, or the Basques like to say, the wounds are in the language. But it's true. And it might sound trivial, but just driving on the A55 and noticing just how long it takes to say service station in Welsh is a reminder that your view is not the only view. I don't know if I said this before, but like children want to be seen in their gender and in their class, in their race. So their language needs to be heard a little bit too. I have a really funny story about this, that we used to live in France, and I have my youngest daughter is incredibly, she would have been about 6 at the time, and she was so dear. She was this elegant little thing that was straight out of Jane Austen, who was so polite and mellifluous in her voice. But she didn't speak French, and we sent her to the local primary school where she learned French from her friends. There's a saying that when you learn a new language, you gain a new soul. So she would come home and she would speak to us in English in this kind of floaty, charming, pre-Raphaelite, Jane Austen-y voice of hers. Oh, hello, yes, it's been such a lovely day. Then she would turn to her friend and speak to her in Ch'ti, which is the dialect of Lille, the big, rainy, rough and tumble industrial town in France in which she lived. So she would come home and say, yes, thank you, I've had a darling day in school. It's been so nice. And then she'd turn to her friend and go, mais non, tu fais le quoi? So she learned not just a vocabulary, but a kind of different body language. I'm not sure it was entirely useful, but it's a lesson. So my thought for International Literacy Day in terms of languages, another story. My son worked for a long time with Irish travellers, who are another group that have this minority language that is looked down on and despised, not even a half language really. And he worked with them in prisons. He was a kind of advocate for Irish travellers in English jails. And they disproportionately go to jail. And it became very, very clear to my son that fundamentally, what they were in jail for was not being able to read and write. That literacy rights are very high. So they didn't understand their rights. They sometimes didn't understand, sometimes they were serving sentences in jail that were absolutely ludicrous, simply because they hadn't applied for their cases to be reconsidered, they hadn't contested their cases. They were completely a victim of what is a very, very literate society. Everything is done in writing, more so than ever. People no longer converse, they text. So we depend on writing more than ever. So more than ever, we should be aware that being able to read is a fundamental right in the way that the right to water, food, and housing is. If we have decided to live in this sort of digital world, then we have to pony up and make sure that everybody can navigate their way around it.
So for my young readers, I'd like to encourage you to, next time you go to a library or a bookstore, have a look for a book that tells a story of someone very different to you. This might be a story of somebody who lives in a different part of the world. Maybe it's somebody who has grown up in a different culture. Maybe if you're a boy, maybe you just want to read about what it's like to be a girl, because this is a way that you can actually understand what it's like to be someone else in a really powerful way. And even reading stories about animals, I think, is a really great way for us to understand that animals have feelings and they have connections and relationships with humans who they live with and other animals. And I think a really great example of that is one of my favorite books from childhood, which is Charlotte's Web. And I remember for the first time, it really made me look at animals in a different way. So if you don't know the story, Charlotte's Web is a beautiful story about a girl who lives on a farm, and she's able to listen to the animals talking among themselves. And so she's able to see what their experience of the world is like. And in a way, when you read books, this is what it does. It invites you into the world of somebody else, or into the mind of, even in this case, in Charlotte's Web, it was told from the perspective of a little pig and his best friend who was a spider. So I can't actually think of any other way that you can really go into the world or the minds of what it's like to be someone else. Even when you're watching a movie, you're kind of looking at it from the outside in. Whereas when you read a book, you're really invited into somebody's world. It's an incredible experience. And don't forget that even if you find reading difficult, you can still access amazing stories. I mean, through audiobooks, graphic novels have fantastic stories, and comics as well. And telling stories is a really great way of expressing who you are and the things that matter to you. And I'm lucky enough that this is something I've always loved doing, and I've always found reading easy. And this is something that I get to do every day, which I always feel very honoured and privileged that I can live in my imagination, create stories, and hopefully those will turn into books that will connect with some of my young readers like you. So reading is a great way to understand yourself. It's a great way to understand the world, and it's a great way to learn what it's like to be someone else. So find the best way that suits you to pick up a book and engage with the story within.
What a lovely thing to be asked to do, to leave a message for young readers. Reading has been so important in my life. I hope it is really important in your life too. Let me talk first of all to those of you who are already reading fluently, with your head stuck in a book from morning to night. It's fabulous, and I envy you. I envy you reading those stories for the first time, those stories that I loved so much when I was growing up. Try to keep reading. Sometimes as you get older, as you head into those teenage years, there's a temptation to leave it behind you. Maybe it's not cool anymore. I would beg you, don't do that. Books can bring you anywhere. It doesn't matter what your situation is now. Books can show you other situations. Books can tell you what your life might be. And books can just fill you with happiness. So stay reading. Read for pleasure. Practice. Sometimes you have to practice to get really good at something. But you can do it. You can already read. So now read for pleasure and read widely. Never be stuck at a bus stop, bored in the rain, waiting for the bus, when you could pull a book out of your bag and read a magnificent story that could take you into a world that you never even imagined before. And now a word to those of my young friends out there who find it difficult to read. Some of you may have dyslexia or other reading difficulties. Here's what I want to say to you. Don't get caught up in the idea that reading is just about breaking down words, making sounds to make sense. That's only one small part of reading, the one we mostly deal with in school. It's called decoding words, and it's great to be able to do that. But if at the moment you're struggling with that, there's a whole other world of reading that has nothing to do with that. That's the world of story, and that's the most important part. When we say reading, the word isn't really accurate, because you can listen to an audiobook. You don't have to read it yourself. As long as you get the story, as long as you are carried away to somewhere else, being someone else for that time that you're reading a book, you are the main actor in your own play when you're reading. So don't worry about not being able to decode. That will come. But don't let it stop you enjoying audiobooks. Beg an adult to read to you. Bribe them if you have to. There are ways around every problem. The most important thing I want to say to you, and the message I want to leave with you, is read. Because you don't know now, but you will know in the future how important that is going to be.
What's my message for children? Before I tell you my message for children, can I give you a message? Can I just say thank you for something? Can I say thank you for P.L. Travers? I grew up in the northwest of England. I mean, you'd be horrified. England is so small, but I never went down south. I was an adult before I went to London. And the first place I went to in London was Regent's Park, which is the setting for the Mary Poppins stories, which were written by P.L. Travers, who of course grew up in Queensland and didn't go to England until she was in her 20s. I had imagined London through her eyes. And there seems something really specific about that, something worth treasuring about that, that she drew this picture of London, which, by the way, is filtered through ideas of Irish mythology, because she was knocking around with Yeats and Oliver St. John Gogarty and all these sort of Celtic Dawn guys. So what a kind of set of filters to look at a city through. And she painted this incredibly beguiling image of a city of parks and magic, and that idea that anybody could be something really strange. It's wonderful. It was really wonderful and beguiling, and it was much more through her than through anybody else that I encountered London. So we see things, and that's a London seen through fresh eyes, the eyes of a newcomer with her own weird set of filters. Yeats believed in fairies. That's a whole kind of exchange of stories that's going on there. First time I went to London, I went with my girlfriend, who is now my wife, all these years later. And I was just like absolutely transported to be in Regent's Park, with the very, very dimmest awareness that for other people, it was just a shortcut from the Euston Road to Primrose Hill. But for me, it was just like, oh, this is the magic place. So thank you, Australia, for seeing my country differently. My message to children for International Literacy Day is it's just very simple. That's why I put this story at the top. Just read a lot. Read a lot. It's enriching. And read a lot because of what happened to me in that story. Read a lot, not because it increases your attainment or because it makes you a better citizen, but because it makes you a happier person. It builds a happy place inside you. It builds the apparatus of happiness. When I went to London that very ordinary day with not enough money just to have a look around, I was looking at it through this amazing kaleidoscopic telescope of stories that people had told me. So thank you, and have a great day. And thank you for listening. Oh, did I mention I've got a medal? Yeah, I've got a medal, just in case you're wondering.